There's no choice about how you spend your time, how you spend a portion of your life, decisions you make about relationships, about parenting, about work. There's no option that comes with no downside. So all you're really ever doing is choosing which downside to incur. What we spend a lot of our lives doing, I think, is sort of wriggling around or frozen, hoping that there's some option going to come along that has no negative downsides. But that, of course, has its own negative downside, which is that your time is passing by.
All right, let's kick off today's show. Today we're talking with best-selling author Oliver Burkeman about his groundbreaking theory of imperfectionism. Oliver Burkeman is the author of the Sunday Times best-selling 4,000 Weeks Time Management for Mortals. Oliver's newest book is titled Meditations for Mortals, 4 Weeks to Embrace Your Limitations and Make Time for What Counts. He shares how to stop sabotaging yourself with perfectionism that prevents real action, learn how decision hunting breaks through paralysis into momentum, discover why treating yourself worse than others destroys your potential, and find freedom in accepting limitations instead of fighting for them. Welcome to the show, Oliver. So great to have you.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
We would love to know how this project came together because you cover a lot of ground in this book, and obviously I'd love to hear the backstory.
I guess the backstory to the new book was this sense that I had in my own life, but also encountered among a bunch of people that I encountered in life, that it's possible to have like a really strong sense of how you want to live and the work you want to do and how you want to show up in life and all the rest of these things, and just not do it all the same for like months and years on end, right? To sort of have a very clear picture of how you want things to be and just not put it into practice. So I really wanted to address this specific question of the gap between knowing and doing, and all the kind of strange inhibitions and mistaken beliefs about what it is to be human that end up causing us to not actually just get on and do things. So I guess that's the overview.
Yeah, and it's broken down into 4 themes. Maybe you could walk us through the themes and the order, and then we can dig into some of these meditations.
Sure. So the idea here is to sort of unpack this philosophy that I call imperfectionism, just my umbrella term, I guess, for the outlook on life that begins from saying, like, what happens if instead of constantly trying to get more done and feel more in control of things and understand more and more and more about the world, what if we started from the position that there would always be too much to do, that we're never going to be able to feel confident about what's coming in the future, that we're never going to feel completely ready for launching ambitious projects and new chapters in life, but we want to do those things anyway, right? Despite never getting to this position of control. So the 4 weeks of this kind of 4-week exploration are firstly, the first one's called Facing Finitude. It's about sort of acknowledging what it is to be a limited, finite human. Second one is about taking action in that situation, how to actually do stuff and the right stuff, I guess, in that situation. Third one is called Letting Go. And it's about the way in which it's very often a matter of stepping out of the way and letting things happen instead of necessarily making them happen. It's not all about willpower and such. It's often about taking a sort of looser and gentler approach to things. And then the 4th week is called Showing Up. And that's really, I guess, the goal of all of this is to kind of live more intensely, live more fully than we otherwise have a tendency to do.
Yeah, I think the book starts out with the hardest pill for probably many of our listeners to swallow, which is imperfection. So many of our
Right.
listeners are high achievers and seeking perfectionism and looking for the next challenge. And many of them are quote unquote self-help junkies. And I know the book is laced with, a lot of self-help theories and even systems to try to get to that meaningful life. But really understanding and starting with imperfection, I think, is the hardest pill for a lot of us to swallow. What was the insight there for you in starting this movement?
Well, I mean, it's personal experience of the very same thing, right? I'm dealing with my own issues as much as anybody's here, and I use a sort of pretty broad definition of perfectionism. I think the thing that is most familiar is the idea of wanting the work that you produce to be absolutely flawless. But I think people pleasing is a form of perfectionism, right? Wanting everybody around you to be completely happy with what you're doing all the time. I think imposter syndrome is a strange form of perfectionism because it's basically this demand that you feel absolutely experienced and ready before you do stuff. So I think in all sorts of ways, we're making these perfectionistic uh, demands on ourselves. And what I want to try to express in the book, certainly, is that like doing the reverse of that is not just about like cutting yourself some slack and settling for mediocrity, right? It's actually the perfectionism is the thing that gets in the way of doing things in the sort of most uh, absorbing and meaningful way. So it's like the classic case of this, obviously, is that like if you is the perfectionism is very closely connected to procrastination. If you the best possible way to stay in possession of this beautiful fantasy of how great your book is going to be or how great your new home is going to be or your new business venture is like to never ever launch it, because then you get to sort of cherish this beautiful fantasy. The moment you actually do anything in the world, it's automatically by definition not going to be perfect. So there's a really close connection between um, not between imperfectionism and actually doing the stuff. I think a lot of us are raised to be what psychologists call insecure overachievers. So people who do a whole bunch of stuff and have outwardly great lives, and our friends look at us and say we're driven and we're accomplished, and it's all true. But on some level, we're doing it to kind of because we don't feel like we're enough unless we reach the the next bar and the next bar. And I want to kind of help people let go of that and replace it with a different kind of ambition, I suppose.
Well, so much of that is framed around what other people think, what other people's definition of perfection is, what other people's definition of success is. And, for many of our clients, one of the first things we work on is their personal brand and stepping outside of their comfort zone and sharing a bit more of themselves online in an authentic way. And immediately what happens is people respond. And oftentimes the response is, what are you doing? Why'd you post that on LinkedIn? Why are you starting a podcast? Why are you firing up an Instagram? And immediately that judgment of others like completely freezes them again. And they don't feel good about stepping further outside of that comfort zone. And it's this comparison that's just constantly being juggled. And it's funny that you bring up the opposite end where oftentimes a lot of people would look on the outside and be like, well, you are achieving, you are doing great things, but it's that negative comparison that holds so many of us back.
Yeah, totally. And obviously, the first thing you do when you launch anything new is you compare yourself to all the people who are multiple years into it or the most successful people in the field. You compare everything you're doing to everything you're actually doing to all the things you think you ought to be doing or could be doing, and that's obviously like an infinite possibility space. So you never feel good about yourself by comparison. I do think, I don't know if you agree with this, but I do think that in the examples you give and in other areas of life, it's really astounding though how frequently just sort of being honest about who you are and not even trying to sort of burnish a facade in any particular way has this amazing connective um, power. I'm always struck when I'm writing my email newsletter. If I write something about how I've been experiencing feeling completely overwhelmed with email, say, to pick a cliched example, and then I give some ideas for handling this and some perspectives, people might benefit from the techniques or the tips, but what they really seem to benefit from is just the bit where I mention that I'm going through this too. There's something incredibly powerful about people just dropping the facade and acknowledging that we're all sort of struggling in these ways. So I think, though that pressure of comparison and seeing the perfect outsides of other people and comparing them to your imperfect insides, it's obviously a huge issue, especially in social media spaces. Once you can get over that hump and just be like, I'm going to be myself, you're kind of uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like that's really powerful. You're kind of undefeatable then, because it's like, yeah, like there's nothing to be exposed here that I'm trying to hide.
Yeah, I think the first wave of feedback is always, why are you going outside the box? Why are you going outside the norm? Why are you putting yourself out there in this way? And then the second wave is, oh my God, I feel that way too. Or, oh my God, I didn't realize that side of you. Yes,
Yeah.
I have that similar perspective, or I've been facing that same struggle. And it's not about the system or the lesson or the takeaway or the tactic. It's like, hey, we're all in this imperfect world together. We're all seeking things that might not be achievable for us as hard as we try, and as much as we like to paint this perfect facade on social media or online about what's going on. And even the guests that we've had on the show, when they've shared the more personal struggles versus all the reasons that they're successful in coming on the show, that's resonated the most with their audience. And you see it in the downloads, you see it in the feedback that we get. But so often when we are talking about ourselves, we try to keep this perfect facade up of like, well, it's effortless. I'm not going through a struggle.
Yeah.
It has been easy to get here.
And yet it's crazy when you stop to think about it. Like, I mean, if you were going through some serious issues in your life, would you want to go see a therapist who had never had any struggles themselves and who was sort of completely undamaged by the experience of life? That would be a disaster. You don't want to talk to that person. I think that I guess what I think of myself as doing in this writing is kind of, maybe being sort of 1 to 2 steps ahead of the people I'm writing for, but certainly not trying to present that I don't struggle with all this stuff. That's why it's interesting to me, right? That's why talking about using finite time and struggling with perfectionism and like actually doing stuff instead of just thinking about it. Like, this is why it's such a sort of engaging topic for me to want to write about, is that it hasn't been plain sailing with me in this regard.
I think it's also important when it comes to all the comparisons to find the one angle that you feel competent in. Once you have that one angle, that one area that you feel competent in, you can focus there, getting better, which drives your mind from all the comparison and contrast and focusing on your progress. And then I think slowly everything else will fall into place. But if you're trying to concentrate on all of the aspects, you're not going to concentrate on any of them. And you will stay in that comparison and contrast because there is no focus.
Right. And I think that, yeah, what you're talking about there in the context of like, having a personal brand or communicating with people in a sort of one-to-many form, the more that you are, I think it works in the rest of life too, the more that you are who you are, the more sort of that is uniquely the thing that you excel at anyway, right? I mean, there's nobody else can be your combination of things. And I have to remind myself of this all the time, right? It's like very tempting to see some particular newsletter do well or some particular bit of a book do well and think like, okay, I've got to become the kind of person who just serves that kind of thing to the people who like. Actually, it's much more effective to sort of focus on whatever is genuinely making me feel like passionate and interested right now. And if the result is a kind of a hodgepodge of things, there will be people in the world who are into that hodgepodge of things.
One of the meditations that struck me was the consequences. And it's something that my wife and I have been going back and forth around now as new parents, is all the decisions you're faced and all of the ought tos and shoulds and have tos, and not really recognizing that, well, there are consequences in inaction that are also happening here. And oftentimes we try to avoid consequences, but in avoiding those consequences, we're facing even more difficult consequences as a part of that. And I think as we've tried to navigate parenthood now, we're looking at, okay, well, let's weigh out the consequences here. Let's think about the consequences. And it's often counterintuitive to think that frees you up. But that's something that we've been sharing, just going back and forth as parents. And that was really poignant in the book, just recognizing that there are consequences. And once you start to actually wrestle with how finite life is and how finite things can be, those consequences and recognizing them actually unlock a level of freedom in your decision making and moving forward to find that meaning.
This idea, the quote that I'm sort of riffing off in that chapter is from Sheldon Kopp, the psychotherapist, who says, "You're free to do whatever you like. You need only face the consequences." And this is such a sort of powerful mental shift, or it was for me, because he's saying, I think, that, there's no choice about how you spend your time, how you spend a portion of your life, decisions you make about relationships, about parenting, about work. There's no option that comes with no negative, with no downside. So all you're really ever doing is choosing which downside to incur. There are certainly downsides to, parenting, and there are certainly downsides to not becoming a parent, and you can replicate this across every area of life. What we spend a lot of our lives doing, I think, is sort of wriggling around or frozen, hoping that there's some option going to come along that has no negative downsides. But that, of course, has its own negative downside, which is that your time is passing by as you fail to decide. So I think, it's not freedom. I think I put this in the book, right? It's not freedom from the human situation and freedom from limitation, but it's freedom in the human situation, freedom in limitation, by being clear-eyed about the fact that there'll always be a downside to anything you decide. So you're just deciding which problem you want to incur.
Yeah, and are you willing to pay the price? And I think that's what's also so interesting about the comparison piece, because we oftentimes look at the highlight reels and the success of others, and it's like, well, are you willing to pay the price of the journey that they were on to get to that point that you're now comparing yourself to? And oftentimes that price is not posted on social media. We're not talking about all of the struggles to get there. But when you actually are on the inside and you get a chance to be around more successful people, you recognize, okay, well, some of these prices I'm not willing to pay. I'm not willing to go through the sleepless nights. I'm not willing to sacrifice that.
And if you know that, and it's going to limit your lifetime income or your lifetime prominence and profile, but you know it, that's great. Like, that is success in a different definition, right? Because that is self-knowledge. If you're just intimidated by a different kind of life, that might be something to lean into rather than to sort of run away from. But if it's a real knowing that, like, this is a price I wouldn't be willing to pay, that kind of self-knowledge is golden.
And then also, which of the consequences are a mirage? Like, can the deadline be missed? Can you make your parents unhappy and they'll still love you? Like, oftentimes we have these consequences that we're weighing internally that feel so negative and so great, when in actuality, that deadline can be missed. You can let your parents down with a decision you make around how to raise your child, and they're still going to love you and they're still going to show up for you. So recognizing those invisible consequences that we're wrestling with internally that maybe aren't really consequences when you break it down.
Right. Or even if they are consequences, we sort of think of them as sort of absolute. It's like you get into this mindset. I've been there so much of thinking that, making someone mad at you would be absolutely terrible, the end of the world, or losing a particular friendship or losing a particular income stream would be a total disaster. And, you've got to weigh this in the specific situation you're in. Some particular choices could have very, very, very bad consequences for some people. But again and again, if you can understand those consequences just as more things to be weighed in the balance, then you can weigh them in the balance. And sure, maybe sometimes you're going to decide to do the thing that stops the person being mad at you. But other times you're going to think, I'm willing to tolerate that discomfort of knowing that someone is disappointed or angry, because the thing I'm getting in return is worth it to me.
There might be meaning behind that. So sometimes those invisible consequences can keep you from finding the meaning in your life, like the pleasing of parents and going about a path that they think will make you successful when really they want the best for you. But oftentimes those choices wouldn't be the best for you. And the consequence of letting them down around that choice for you to find meaning is worth it.
You point to two different aspects of this, right? Firstly, you might be surprised how willing people are to fit themselves around and to support your new direction in life or the choice you've made. And secondly, even if that's not true, the consequences of them not being supportive, at least in many cases, might just be something that it's worth living with and living through, because the path of meaning is the one that requires you to do that. There's a lovely line that Stephen Cope, the spiritual writer and yoga person, says somewhere that like, it's kind of alarming. It dawns on a lot of us at some point in the middle of our lives that, like, nobody else really cares what you do with your life. And he's not actually being as jaded and depressing as that sounds. He's not saying that people don't support you and want you to be happy. It's like, you would be surprised how flexible, at least in our culture, shall we say, most people are going to be with what you decide to do with your life, as long as, it's something that they can tell feels like growth, feels like progress and psychological development for you.
One concept that I'd love for you to unpack for our audience, and I know many are feeling, is productivity debt and how it holds us back. Because one of that realizations around how finite things are is, well, there's a never-ending to-do list. We can constantly chase more productivity, and that debt is never-ending.
This phrase, I just use productivity debt to mean this feeling that I think so many of us have. You sort of wake up in the morning and it's like you're already in debt, and your job to sort of justify your existence on the planet is to produce a certain amount of stuff or to check off a certain number of things on the list. And the very best you can hope for, if the day goes perfectly, is that you just get back to zero balance and then you go to bed and it all starts again the next day. Obviously, if you work for money in any context, right, you are in a certain kind of debt to the person paying for your services or paying your salary, paying your wage. But I'm not talking about that kind of debt. I mean this kind of weird sense of like, I have not really earned the right to exist for today as a human being unless I do this stuff. And as you point to and what you said, it's not only that, but actually the bar that we set ourselves for paying off that debt is very often sort of absurdly high or even kind of infinite, because the number of things that you could usefully do in theory with your day to day is infinite, right? There's no sense in chasing that. So what I'm sort of exploring in that chapter is how liberating it can be to just think, well, what if, just as a thought experiment, what if I started from the perspective that I kind of don't have to do anything today to justify my existence? Maybe a small number of things I have to do to keep a roof over my head, but I'm not engaged in this existential struggle to prove myself. And then actually what people find themselves wanting to do is not do nothing and sit on the couch and watch TV and eat potato chips, right? They find that then you can do all the stuff that you've been wanting to do anyway, launch all the projects and connect to all the people and all this, but no longer out of this deficit thinking like, I got to do it all, otherwise I'm worthless, but just doing it because it's like, that's the most fun way to be alive as a human, is to create stuff and meet people and go places. I think there's something very powerful in that, just sort of seeing that that's how we have a tendency to live, in that feeling of psychological debt. Just seeing that is a big part of releasing it.
Yeah, and it's so powerful. We've seen some clients even make to-do lists of things that they know they're going to do just so they can feel the completeness of being productive, of checking it off. Right?
Yeah, or things you've already done. We've all been there. At
the end of the day. Yeah, let me add those other things that I could add the check to. But what if we weren't starting every day in that debt, that it was all defined by the checks we added?
We had an exercise that we put our X-Factor Accelerator members through, which is to write out their eulogy and to read it to themselves, and which certainly presses the urgency of, well, what are you doing? There's all these things that you want to be remembered for, but yet you're not taking action on any of these things. So now let's talk about what's getting in the way. And are you prepared? Do you want to be remembered for those things? Because you're not going to be if you're not willing to put in this work. And so that people start to reimagine, is that what I want to be? And what are the steps that I could be taking towards that right now? Because
Yeah.
without it, our life is going to be redundant and absurd, living it every day without grand plans.
I think this is one place where this idea of imperfectionism sort of can really come into play, because that kind of eulogy exercise, one way of responding when you look at the thing you've written and you realize that you're not doing with your time the things you want to have done with your life. One way of responding is this fairly kind of macho sort of willpower based thing. Well, okay, I've just got to like force all these things into existence now. Otherwise, what the hell am I doing? But there is another way. I think maybe they both have a role, but there is another way, which is to say, well, if I'm going to bring these things into the world in reality, if I'm going to write the book I want to write, or I'm going to go the place I want to go, build the business I want to build, whatever, maybe it's time to accept that it's, at least in the first iteration, it's not going to meet the perfectionistic standards that I've been holding myself to. Maybe there's actually a way in which going a bit easier on yourself, being a bit gentler with yourself, releases action. That it's not just a recipe for not doing stuff. Like, if you have that kind of response to that kind of eulogy exercise, then you're already not doing stuff. So all you're trying to do here is like invite yourself over the boundary from thinking about it to doing it by whatever means works. And I've found, having tried all sorts of different approaches, that the ones that work for me are not the ones that sort of set up life as a huge battle that I've got to sort of beat life into submission, but instead take it as a sort of lighter, more experimental thing where it doesn't really matter if the first attempt at something is not that good. What matters is 0 to 1. What matters is that it exists in the world in some form, and previously it didn't.
We are definitely huge fans of week 2 and the importance of taking action. So we talk about all these heavy concepts of imperfectionism and comparison, and it can be easy then to just sit with that. Like, life is finite and I have consequences, and in that indecision, not act. And we have a saying that you can't think your way into acting, but you can act your way into thinking. You can take actions that change your beliefs, that shape your values, that move you closer to that eulogy that you wrote down. What does it mean to decision hunt? Because I think that concept that you introduced will be so powerful for our audience.
Once I've sort of encouraged people to give up, abandon all hope in the first week of this book, I was like, okay, that's now the perfect situation in which you can actually do cool stuff, because you're no longer holding yourself to these crazy making standards. And I think one of the absolutely best tactics that I know for actually doing the stuff is this idea that I call decision hunting. I'll explain why I call it that. I think there's an awfully huge literature, right, about how to make good decisions and how to make the best decisions. But we always seem to imply in those contexts that like decisions are these things that come along in your life. Like, you're walking through life and everything's fine, and then a decision comes your way and you've got to decide, like, do I take this job offer? Do I accept this marriage proposal? Do I make a marriage proposal to this person? Or do I whatever? But that's a very reactive, kind of passive stance on decisions. I think it can be really powerful to think of decisions as things to go looking for. In other words, if you feel kind of stuck in some area of life, to sort of look at that area of your life and say, like, what is some decision that I could make here that would take me down one path and close off other paths? And the really interesting thing about this is it doesn't need to be big, right? It doesn't need to be a big decision, like striding into your boss's office and informing him that you quit because you're gonna strike off on your own and do something else. It can be any kind of tiny decision, as long as it is sort of more or less a real decision that sets you off down one path rather than some others. So an example I give in the book, just deliberately to really drive home how mundane this can be, is like, if you want to launch something that involves putting up a website, you can choose the platform that you're going to put it on. You can subscribe to that platform and pay the subscription. And of course you could back out of that choice, but on some level, what you've done is you've taken a point that you were being indecisive about, or that was part of the indecision that you were experiencing. You've got rid of like 7 of the options and chosen the 8th. And now reality is a little bit different, and a new set of decisions present themselves. And the new set of decisions might be about, what you put on that site. These are kind of ridiculously everyday ideas, right? We're not talking about the kind of decisions that seem like change your life decisions, but they are decisions. And they are decisions because they take reality where you had a number of forking paths. You take one path, you spurn the others, and then you're in a different place. And you can move in that incredibly incremental way, decision by decision. No one decision being particularly massive or intimidating or crazy, from all the way through, right? All the way from the start to the finish of a project or a big life change. So that's what I mean by decision hunting. It's getting out of a rut, like basically by going looking for decisions that you could take, however small, as long as they're kind of real decisions.
I love how those decisions start to create wind behind your sails. So in the context for a lot of our clients, they're struggling with, friendship dwindling, kids, family, job changes, not staying in touch with people, just time and the loneliness epidemic that we've talked about. And of course, when they join the program, they want to meet new people. They want to go out there and make new friends. And as the science shows us, that's hours and hours and hours spent with someone to become a real friend. One of the decisions that we encourage them to hunt around is, what if you just reconnected with someone you hadn't talked to in a year?
Right.
What if you just reconnected with that college friend? What's holding you back from reaching out? Oh, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to re-engage. Well, maybe they're thinking the same thing. And maybe just taking that one decision to reach out to them, say you're thinking of them, share a photo of the last time you hung out together, could spark that relationship that you've been missing and can start to work to build that wind behind your sails. Whereas it's completely a bigger decision to what event to go to find someone new, where to go seek out new friendship, and how to create the time and space to build that new friendship. There are a lot of these little decisions that a small amount of fear, not knowing how to do it, are holding us back from taking that action. And oftentimes that decision will lead to momentum and more action and you feeling good socially again.
Absolutely. And it leads to momentum even if that friend has no interest in responding, right? That's
Right.
The crazy thing. It's like the action is what creates the momentum, because you learn from direct feedback that either it leads to something great or it kind of doesn't lead to anything much. It's asymmetric. It's not that it's exceptionally unlikely that if you do the thing that you were suggesting there, that you get a kind of incredibly hostile response. You just might not get any response.
Right.
And that's okay. And I always think about this in the context of, like, as a writer, I think about this a lot, right? Like if you put something out online on social media or something that really energizes people and resonates with them, then hundreds of thousands, millions of people could see that. But if you put something out that doesn't really resonate with people, you're not going to get kind of publicly shamed by millions of people. It's just going to vanish. And like the loss to you is going to be the time it took and nothing else. So there's a lot of those situations where a decision is kind of truly asymmetric. If it works, it could lead to great things, but the loss, if it doesn't work, it is really very small and tolerable.
Well, with that publishing online, this is another concept that you cover in the book, which is this quality versus quantity. And so many of us, especially with the perfectionist mindset, want the first thing to be quality. And there's a recent study around virality of content. And with just the vast number of content being published every single day, 1 out of every 20 to 30 pieces will actually catch enough viewers to even be fed into the algorithms to be viral. So when you start to recognize how this all works, you start to realize, okay, I could post 1 quality piece a month, and then it's going to take me 2 years to build an audience and have other people find me fascinating. Or I could post 20 pieces a week, and then that 1 week I could go viral just due to the sheer quantity of me posting. And of course, the more you do something, the quality starts to follow. And now you have a bit more of a flywheel of you're building an audience, you're getting a response, you're getting better at delivery. And over time, a short amount of time, you could actually catch some actual fire and build a platform for yourself. And this happens in so many other areas of your life, not just online publishing. But oftentimes that quality, the need for quality, is what keeps us from hitting publish, keeps us from doing that thing that's been holding us back or has been gnawing at us.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you rightly say, it's not just that letting go of that a little bit leads to taking action, but it also leads to the quality, right? That's how you're going to get to quality. And certainly with many things, and I think writing is one of them, there isn't even a particularly strong relationship in my experience between like how much time and care and furrowed brow I put into something that I'm writing and how good it comes out at the other end, and how much it resonates with people. When I look back at my work when I was working on the Guardian newspaper, for example, there was no relationship between whether I spent like weeks researching a piece or whether it was just some blog post that I wrote in an hour and a half. It could quite easily be the latter that was, by all normal, sensible standards, a better piece because of its effect in the world. So, it's almost like we imagine that taking it. I think we're raised to think this, right? You put in a lot of effort, you do your homework, you sit down, you're really diligent about it, but then that quickly turns into a sort of endless perfectionistic drama and it never gets done. And even though it does get done, it can have a certain quality of being sort of slightly too worked on, slightly too thought through. There's something to be said for improvisation and spontaneity.
Going along with that, the ability to take those small actions, whether it's making the decision or creating something every single day, the daily practice or the daily-ish practice, as you call it, creates so much opportunity in your life that we're missing out on. And you talk in the book about the Seinfeld strategy and how we can apply it to our own life. So we look at someone like Jerry Seinfeld, who's incredibly successful comedic career, and we see his polished specials, we see the best jokes that have always landed, but there's millions of failures along the way, jokes that no one laughed at, jokes that he got booed off stage, that were part of his craft. And I think so many of us avoid those little daily-ish practices for this quality that we're seeking to our own detriment.
I think that's totally right. I think the other point I'm sort of stressing in the Seinfeld case is people who are familiar with this Seinfeld strategy think that it means like be obsessively consistent every single day, work on the thing. If you drop a day, that's a disaster. I interviewed Seinfeld for The Guardian ages ago, and turned out he didn't mean this at all, really. He was just like totally bemused the way that this idea had come to take on a life of its own. He just means the very obvious truth that if you want to develop a habit, reaching out to new people, reaching out to old people, learning skills, sports, whatever, you got to do a lot of it. You got to do it more days than not. You got to keep showing up. It's not about this kind of incredibly obsessive, like if I miss one day, then it's all over. That's very counterproductive because, life does get in the way in any cases, but especially if, being a parent of small children is involved. I know that from personal experience. So, that's not a very resilient, a sustainable thing. I think one thing that I find really helpful when it comes to that kind of coming back and showing up and keeping doing it is to understand that really in some ways, getting back in the saddle is the skill that you are developing. The skill is not so much meditating every day or working on your creative project every day or reaching out to people every day. The skill is when you fail to do it for a couple of days for whatever reason, developing the ability to come back and do it again, even though your sort of perfect chain of X's on the calendar or whatever was disrupted.
For me, it's asking myself, is this can't or don't want to? If you can't do it, whether it's small children or some impediment in your schedule or you're going to lose an opportunity, that's one thing. But is this me just not wanting to do it, not really feeling like doing it today? Because if it's a matter of not wanting to do it, that's actually the time to do it, because that builds the strength and the consistency that we're talking about here. But not to beat yourself up over the times you can't do it.
Yeah, and it's a subtle balance because moods can be very strong for some people. They always seem to be for me. And it's like, sometimes it would be a huge struggle to force myself to do something I don't want to do. But you're absolutely right that other times, and many times, it's really just like, okay, the price I would have to pay for this is that I won't necessarily feel good while I'm doing it. All right, I can tolerate that. And by the way, you probably end up feeling a lot better as a result of doing it. So yeah, there's lots to be said for that.
Well, so many of us were raised on the golden rule and how to treat others, and you introduced the reverse golden rule and how important it is to treat ourselves. What do you mean by that?
The reverse golden rule, I'm borrowing this from a philosopher called Ido Landau, who makes this very astute observation that, what he calls the reverse golden rule is don't treat yourself in ways that you would never treat other people. It is really striking, I think, how many of us go around with some form of sort of internal monologue berating ourselves for slipping up or not doing things right, not handling situations in the right way. Yeah, in a way that you would just never, you would never behave like that towards your friends because you're not an asshole, right? I mean, it's just like it's just the double standard is extraordinary. And one thing I found really useful about this is like there is a huge amount of literature and advice and all the rest of it about self-compassion. And I've always struggled with it a bit because there's something about it that seems like kind of cringe, basically. There's something about that whole sort of idea that I find sort of doesn't sort of vibe with me. It feels a bit sort of repellent in some way. I'm not saying it is. I'm saying I've got some problem that causes me to receive it in that fashion. But the great thing about the reverse golden rule is it is just the request that you treat yourself the same as other people, right? This isn't about saying, "Oh, I'm so special. I need to really think about myself as the greatest, most sensitive soul in the universe." There's none of that stuff. It's just like, okay, what if I just wasn't any meaner to myself than I am to other people in the world? Just a very sort of democratic approach. And something about that I really like. It's like, okay, I can do that. I'm not sure I can do all this kind of, all this self-love business, but I can certainly do the thing, I think, where I'm just like, not a jerk to myself in the same way that I'm trying most of the time to not be a jerk to other people.
Yeah, or you can be a jerk to yourself and to others, but just don't be a bigger jerk to yourself.
Right, of course, yeah. If you're a jerk to everyone, then the reverse golden rule is just like make sure you're a jerk to everyone. Yeah, exactly. Equal opportunities jerk.
I know we have a lot of people pleasers in the audience, myself included, and what was so interesting in that meditation is recognizing how it is a form of assholery, as Whitney Cummings calls it. And it's like even hearing that, saying that, knowing that I do at times find myself trying to please others, not often thinking about, well, what's going on behind the scenes and how does that make me an asshole? But I thought it was just such a great reframe around what I think many in our audience are struggling. So how do we get out of our own way with people pleasing?
That's a great observation, the Whitney Cummings line. I think part of what she's getting at is that, we're not talking about being good to other people, right? We're talking about this kind of anxious attitude that says, I must always put how people think about me ahead of anything else. I must always make sure that everyone around me is feeling happy and thinking good thoughts about me. This is not only a very poor way to achieve your own goals in life and the things you care about most, but it's a poor way to be good to other people, right? It's not actually helpful to other people because you're sort of, as Cummings points out, right? You're simultaneously treating them with kid gloves. People pick up on the fact that you're just trying to kind of make sure they don't get cross. It presents you in a sort of a pathetic light, and it just doesn't help anybody. And I talk in the book about a moment that was very significant for me early in my career as a journalist, where an editor at The Guardian had asked me if I could write this piece, and I had spent all day not giving her a reply because I was worried that I didn't have the bandwidth to add it to what I was already doing. But I also didn't want to disappoint her because I was an inveterate people pleaser at that point. And eventually I said, no, I just can't do it. And she said, very kindly, in a way that I thought was kinder than I had any right to expect at that point. She said, "Yeah, you know, it's often just easier for everyone if you can't do something, if you say no right away." And of course, it would have been a simpler day for her if I just said no at 9:30 in the morning and she had the rest of the day to find someone else to write this piece. Instead, I left it till 6 p.m. and caused her a problem because I was so concerned with pleasing her. So I think a useful kind of jujitsu move for people pleasers is like, look, if I can't persuade you that this is no good for you, can I at least persuade you that it's no good for the people you think you're pleasing? It's like, it's no good for anybody. And I think the sort of practical path out of this, or the perspective shift that is really practical, is just to understand that other people's emotions are one more thing to be weighed in the balance. They are giving you, if someone does express, firstly, most of the time, no one's going to be mad at you like you think they're going to be mad at you. But secondly, even if they were to be, that would just be one more factor for you to think about. It's not this kind of total absolute thing that you must at all costs prevent from happening. It's just one more factor that you're thinking about. And, sometimes you might decide to take the action that is primarily targeted at causing someone else to feel good. Sure, there's no problem with that. Other times you might say, you know what, I'm going to accept that they're going to perhaps be disappointed or a little bit irritated because the other thing is more important to me. Again, you're choosing the consequences and you're not pretending that there's a version of events that has no consequences. And that is power and freedom, even if sometimes you then choose consciously and deliberately to, do the thing that someone else is going to be more pleased by you doing.
Well, we're often so bad at mind reading other people's needs in those scenarios. So in your example, you're like, oh, I don't want to let her down. I don't want her to think I can't do this. Just help her. She's made this request of me. When in actuality, the relief she felt in finally hearing from you of like, okay, I can move on. I can just get it to a writer who could actually do it.
Yes, right.
Your people pleasing, is getting in the way of. Like, she just needed an answer. She wasn't going to have any judgment on you. It's like, this just has to get done. But I think oftentimes we get so wrapped up in our belief of what we think the other person needs, and that's really where we get in trouble as people pleasers.
I don't want to be unnecessarily mean to people pleasers in the audience. They've already got enough of a problem being a people pleaser. But it's interesting how egocentric it is, actually, right? It's like, it's interesting how much how egocentric it is to think that like someone's whole day is likely to be completely made or ruined based on whether you decide to ask for something that you want or take the decision that you want. I had a version of this when I was, I think I'm a lot better at it than I used to be, but even when I was writing this book and it was a little bit late past the deadline and I was sort of, working fast to make sure it was completed. And I caught myself like with some kind of mental image of my editor at the publisher, who is a kind of high-powered guy who works with lots of like big shot authors. But my mental image, if I don't check myself, is that he's got nothing to do all day but like pace up and down his office, wondering where the hell my manuscript is. And of course, that's an incredibly self-centered thing to think, right? Of course, what you're doing is not that important to everybody else. And actually, that's a very liberating insight because it enables you to sort of get on with doing what you want to be doing without imagining that other people's worlds will stand or fall on the basis of it.
I had a very similar experience recently, entertaining family with a newborn, and in-laws were in town, and I was like, okay, we got to go out, we got to do things and experience LA, and everyone's here. And I ran around and sitting in traffic and trying to get the perfect day. And at the end of the day, we're back home relaxing, and I just asked, what was your favorite part of the day? They're like, actually, the last hour we've been home and we could actually enjoy the baby. And meanwhile, I'm sweating it out in traffic and hauling all this newborn stuff around to different destinations in LA. And that is not at all what they wanted. But that's what I thought would make me the good son in all of this and in showing them a great time in LA.
No, you need to pull that new parent excuse much more forthrightly. It's just
exactly what my wife said.
It doesn't last for that long, right?
No.
When my son was born, all the people I was working with and owed articles to and manuscripts to were suddenly wonderfully accommodating, and it lasted about a year and a half, and then they were like, "Okay,
Okay, I'm on the clock.
So,
Good to know.
Right.
Well, that means it's time to go for our second, right? gotta prolong
Exactly.
it.
Yeah, right.
I'm curious, is there a meditation that you find yourself coming back to over and over again?
There's a few of them, but I think the one that I really benefit from reminding myself about is this one that I put right at the end, or almost at the end, which I call starting from sanity. And this is a sort of slightly obscure idea to communicate, but I'll have a go. It's the idea that if you want to be a certain way, if you want to show up in life in a certain way, you have to sort of find some way to do a little bit of that right now today, instead of seeing it as this thing that you're working towards and that you're gonna one day manage to bring about, but for now it's not for you. So one example of this is just one example, but like maybe you're at a stage in your life where you actually feel like a bit more rest and a little bit less frenetic action would be really beneficial for you. Well, some people will take that and they'll be like, okay, I want to live a much more restful life. So in a year, I'm going to take a sabbatical, I'm going to do all these cool things, and be a relaxed person. But so to get there, I've got to first of all like really put my head down and work hard and get financial security and get all the projects out of the way. And so you end up working way harder, right? Because you're seeing this thing that you want as something that you're getting to. The alternative would be to say, like, how can I find 10 minutes today to do something restful? How can I show up in that way, at least a little bit right away? And I think that's the really important thing. I find it so easy if I don't stay conscious of this to see all the things that I really care about in life as things that I'm working my way towards, instead of things that I'm seeking to embody right here. And of course, life is finite, so you can't spend your whole life planning to do these things in the future. You have to do them in the present at some point.
And unfortunately, we don't know when that finite end is.
Absolutely.
So it's even more pressing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and helping us embrace our limitations, Oliver. Where can our audience find out more about the book?
You can pick up the book or the audiobook, which I narrated, wherever you standardly get those things. And then my website, oliverburkeman.com, has information about my newsletter and all the rest of it.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oliver.
Been a pleasure. Thank you. Cheers.